I want to talk a little bit about what makes something news. Um, the case is that, what is news is kind of one of these old questions, and it kind of changes depending upon the person. But, sometimes it's something unusual. Death is usually news, people dying. But usually it's something that stands out. It can be timeliness. It's something that's happening. It's something that involves a lot of people. A festival or a big event at a club or organization or church could be news. It could be tragic. It could be life-affirming. It could be all kinds of things. Accidents, death, murders. All of these things are news. But usually what happens, and usually the key is timeliness is one of the keys for all news. It has to be something that's recent. I mean, you wouldn't make a front page story out of Lincoln's death or funeral. Oh, wait, they did that last week in Springfield because they're going to do a reenactment. But the news is the reenactment, not his death. The other thing so that's part of it. But there's also the issue of it's something that is timely. It's something occurring recently. Something recent. You wouldn't probably have a story or running a story about a murder that happened 7 years ago or 6 years ago, unless there was some new development. So it has to be recent, and it has to be somewhat unusual in some regard. It has to be something that makes people go, "Oh, that's kind of unusual." Now, it doesn't always have to be unusual. It could be things that just involve a lot of people, like government issues or school issues, a consolidation or whatever. But then there's also the unusual, which is sort of that category that's a little bit lumpier, not easy to digest. You have the things like, the council's meeting is going to be news because the city council affects people. What the president's doing is news. It affects people. What's happening today in the park, like a big festival or band playing, that's news because people want to know what's going on. But there's also this category of the unusual. And the unusual has to do with things that aren't typical. And that can vary from person to person. What you may consider unusual, I may not consider unusual. I just gave the same lecture to the editing class, so I'll use it again here. But I was recently watching How I Met Your Mother, the TV show, and there was an episode in which the character Marshall says he was mugged, and he gets home and he says he was mugged, and so his wife gets really upset, and he then backs off of it and says, "Oh, I was actually mugged by a monkey. I went to the zoo and the monkey took my wallet," and so this became a kind of a running. So then it became kind of a, oh, he got mugged by a monkey. It was a joke where. But one of the things that happens is the news, one of the people on the show is Robin, and she is a TV news person. And so she's like, oh, that's an unusual story. I've been looking for somebody for my morning TV program with unusual stories, so I think I will see if Marshall can come on and talk about being mugged by a monkey. Marshall wasn't actually mugged by a monkey, so now he's getting worried because he's going to be talking about how this zoo monkey mugged him, and he's going to be doing all this stuff, and so it's going to be a problem, and so he's trying to do it without admitting that he's lied to his wife or whatever, and so he's like, well, that's not really news. A monkey mugging isn't unusual. Monkey muggings happen all the time in Costa Rica and India and other places. And that is true. Monkeys do steal stuff and take stuff, and sometimes they are trained to steal and take stuff. And so a monkey mugging may not be unusual if you're in Costa Rica, but at least in New York City, if you get mugged by a monkey at the zoo, I think that's probably unusual enough to be a news story. But that's a case where it's somewhat case by case. I also remember one day when one of our reporters came back and she was covering health, and she came back and she says, oh, I got a great story. I was at the hospital and there was a new baby born, and the baby was there, and the mother, of course, and as well as her parents and her grandparents, and then they were going to later on in the day bring by their great-great-grandmother or whatever this new baby. So there's going to be like 5 generations there. Isn't that crazy? Well, it is a little unusual, but actually, it was actually common maybe like 30 years ago or 40 years ago that they would take these 5-generation photos. 5 generations where, you have, suppose you have a kid today. So you, your new kid, your parents, your grandparents, and your great-grandparents. Well, it's a little unusual to have all those people alive. Like, for example, my grandfather is 90. My mother is, in her 60s. I'm in my 30s. My kids are, new. They're 3 and 2. And so they are, there's only 4 generations of it. To have a 5th generation would have required for one of my great-grandparents to still be alive, and the last one of them that was alive was my great-grandmother of my grandmother, and she died when I was in grad school, which would have been about 15 years ago, or 13 years ago, or something like that. So, it would be unusual, but it does happen. My brother has a 7-year-old. If she died 13 years ago, there was a 6 years. If they'd had a kid 6 years earlier, there would have been 5 generations. But for the most part, that's become more normal as people have begun to live longer, and so sometimes papers would publish 5 generations photos, but now they typically don't. Smaller papers would, but they've stopped doing it because it's become too common. With longevity, people live longer, and a lot of times. It's just not unusual because, if you had a baby at 22 and, that's 2 generations, and your parents had a baby at 22, that's, 3 generations, your parents are 44, their parents are 22, we'll say 66, 88, that would not be unusual to have an 88-year-old and a newborn. So, making it unusual is perhaps a case-by-case category, and what you find interesting is somewhat you have to learn. But it really comes down to you just going, that's neat, that's interesting, but also realizing that it really is neat and interesting, that it's not something that's common. And that's kind of one of those keys, is that is probably the biggest and most difficult aspect of newsworthiness to capture. That, it's not only timeliness, it's accidents, it's death, it's city action, it's state action, it's, politics, etc., but it's also things that are unusual.